morning, everyone. Thank you so much for your time. This is the 2018 MEC team from the United States Air Force Academy. I'm C2C Royce. I'm a legal studies major.
I'm C1C Madeline Lively, and I'm a philosophy major.
I'm C1C Min Vaughn. I'm also a legal studies major.
I'm C2C Liam Connolly. I'm a political science major.
So, first and foremost, we're going to give you some background information. And I'm going to go into our strategic outlook. Then we're going to describe the three types of attacks we expect most from the North Koreans: a sustained cyber attack, a conventional attack, and a hybrid attack. After we've done that, we'll give you our recommendations.
So in terms of background, up until this point, North Korea has been taking provocative action in the cyber domain. We're forced to consider three different types of attack: sustained cyber attack, hybrid attack, and a conventional attack. This team here, we're a joint team at US Cyber Command. We're going to take four different considerations into account when thinking about these scenarios: ethical, legal, tactical, and strategic. Now, one of the biggest challenges that we faced with this scenario was filling in the blanks. What I mean by that was based on the information that we were given, there was a lot of ambiguity. For example, when you think about conventional warfare, that could include a vast spectrum of activities. That could be something as simple as North Korea using artillery fire on a disputed island off the coast of the Korean Peninsula. It could also include activities such as mass infantry invasion across the 38th parallel into South Korea. Slide, please. This was our greatest challenge. On the left, that's obviously the United States. This image is a reflection of the fact that every single American, every single day, depends on the cyber domain. From the public sector to the private sector, from defense to banking, cyber impacts the way that every single American lives their life. On the right, that's the Korean Peninsula, and in red, that's North Korea. It's dark. Public sector, private sector, North Korea doesn't depend very heavily on cyber. And so, with this in mind, thinking about the scenario, we're living in a glass house throwing stones at a mud hut. Slide, please. This is what we call our ideal strategic outlook. This is the way we would like things to look at the end of the conflict once all the dust settles. We'd like to return to a pre-conflict equilibrium, preserve stability among great powers in the region. Look at a map of Northeast Asia. North Korea shares a border with both Russia and China. You have an ascendant Japan in the south, and the United States obviously has an immense presence in this part of the world. We'd like to avoid crippling and inducing shame on North Korea and the Kim regime, and we're not interested in nation building. This is largely in accordance with the current presidential administration's national security strategy, a reflection of the difficulty that we've had with nation building and regime change in the Middle East over the course of the better part of the last 2 decades. Slide, please. This is what we refer to as our adjusted strategic outlook. We understand that at a certain point, we can no longer tolerate the existence of the Kim regime. Should a certain threshold be crossed, we'd have to remove the Kim regime, rebuild North Korea, normalize relations. With this being said, we also understand that it's dangerous to establish explicit red lines or thresholds in advance. Possible red lines, however, include ground forces crossing the 38th parallel, artillery fire on Seoul, or nuclear attack. We also understand that there's a humanitarian aspect to this as well. The way things stand right now, North Koreans are suffering under the Kim regime. There's starvation, there's maltreatment. People are really suffering. And regime change, we think that we could really impress, obviously there'd be difficulties, but impress US norms, rebuild the people there. Lastly, it's important to note that we think a sustained cyber attack would not be enough to shift our strategic outlook from the ideal that we talked about before and what you see here with the adjusted strategic outlook. Slide, please.
So our first scenario, this is in the event of a sustained cyber attack on us by North Korea. This isn't going to include any kinetic elements. This is a cyber attack. What we believe this is going to look like is going to follow the trajectory of previous activities that we've seen from North Korea. North Korea targeting our public infrastructure, private companies such as Sony, bugging our military assets, trying to get information, overall compromising our capabilities. Slide, please. These are the 3 COAs we developed in response to the sustained cyber attack. The first is what's called active defense. This is an idea we got from Chinese cyber attacks. They employ a defensive mechanism through offensive cyber means. This looks like a plethora of small attacks on government and military servers that basically distracts them and focuses their attention on that since they can't do as many offensive operations. In the next COA, we're going to target these Chinese hackers that are paid by North Korea to attack us by freezing North Korea's electronic assets. It's important to note that North Korean economy relies mostly on paper money and not on electronic assets. Electronic assets are mainly used for military and government reasons and to pay international hackers. Our last COA is PSYOPs. There's 2 components, civilians and military. We're going to spread disparaging information about the regime, reveal truth, and good information about ourselves to civilians to threaten the Kim regime, show them that we can touch your people. North Korea has mandatory propaganda time, which is basically when North Korean people are mandated to turn on their television for like 2 hours and watch North Korean propaganda. So if we are able to access this and use this for our own means, we believe this is a great opportunity for us. The next part, the military component, is to hack into military systems. We're not necessarily looking to cripple them, we're looking to threaten them, show them we can touch you. Slide, please.
So before I actually go into my legal analysis, I want to make a couple of things clear. First of all, there are no set international norms for how that govern cyber warfare. Unlike conventional warfare, cyber warfare doesn't have rules or laws that states abide by when they conduct warfare, right? So the only resource that we can reference to is the Talon Manual, which is basically a set of expert opinions who have drawn their opinions from existing international norms and stretched them to meet cyber warfare. Next, I want to identify two terms that I'll be using throughout my analysis. And first is distinction, right? So what is this distinction? Distinction is identifying what type of target it is, whether it be military, civilian, or protective objects. Now, obviously, we can attack those military targets. However, we cannot attack civilian or protected objects. And protected objects are basically resources like hospitals or schools, stuff of that sort that are vital to a society's survival. In addition, proportionality, what proportionality does basically is to balance the military advantage gained by the attacking state against the potential harm to the civilian population. Now, the actual legal definition of proportionality says that the civilian damage cannot exceed an excess against the military advantage gained. So, having said that, I'll actually move on to my legal analysis, and I find that all three attacks are acceptable. First of all, legal or active defense, basically DDoS, right? We're attacking their government and military systems and compromising or deterring their ability to talk amongst themselves and to actually be able to use their systems. Now, a real-life example of this is the Talon attack in Estonia. So what basically happened is, reportedly, Russian hackers attacked Estonia's government systems through a series of DDoS attacks over the span of a couple of days. However, what happened then was those DDoS attacks actually went outside the government and military systems and started influencing the civilian economy and the transportation systems. We don't see this likely happening in the case of North Korea because North Korea doesn't have a lot of advanced electronic or cyber capabilities. Instead, most of these capabilities are mainly used by the government and the military. A lot of civilians don't have access to these capabilities. So, in distinction, we're only attacking military or government targets. And proportionality, right, the military advantage gains by interfering with their ability to use these systems and be able to actually, let's say, communicate amongst themselves is greatly outweighs the potential harm that we can do to North Korean civilians. In addition, freezing the electronic finances in order to deter them being able to hire foreign hackers, right? Again, I find this acceptable. What we basically are doing is targeting non-existent cash for North Koreans, right? So North Korea has a paper-based economy. North Korean civilians don't have access, again, like I said, to the electronic systems. They don't have e-finances. So as a result, we're not having any harm or substantial harm to these civilians. And thus, the proportionality, the military advantage that we gain from attacking these capabilities heavily outweighs the harm done to civilians. And for PSYOPs, we find this acceptable. We've done these in the past, and I don't see any reason why we can't do these in the future.
For the ethical considerations, I'm going to begin this with saying it's going to sound similar to our legal analysis. And the reason for this is that ethics is the basis for our legal system. We make laws about what we can or can't do based on our concerns of what we should be doing. They're going to sound pretty similar. When we're talking about war and ethics, we're using just war theory, just war tradition, this long-standing history of looking at our ethical guidelines even when we're in war, which is something that can be morally vague. Cyber is a new domain. It offers a list of new possibilities and new weapons to be used differently. However, inasmuch as it's being used in a war, they're used as a weapon, this means that just war theory should apply to cyber as well. Philosopher George Lucas coins the term jus in silico, which is fancy Latin for justice in cyber warfare. This is how we're applying just war theory in the cyber domain. For this analysis, we're going to be using an effects-based approach, which means that we're going to look at these cyber weapons and say they might look different than the conventional weapons and use different means, but in as much as they are producing the same effects, that's how we're going to analyze them based on our ethical guidelines. Within jus in bello, so justice in war, there are two main principles, discrimination and proportionality. The basis for these is the belief in rights, that humans have certain rights that need to be protected. We understand that in the middle of a war, some people surrender some of these rights. So armed combatants surrender the right not to be attacked by people, but their civilian counterparts don't. So when we are waging war and attacking things, we need to make sure that we're discriminating, that we are targeting those legitimate military targets, not the civilians. That's discrimination. Proportionality is the second part of that. We understand that this is war. It's dirty, and that even when we take care to discriminate, there's always going to be possible collateral damage to civilians. Proportionality means that we consider those effects, that collateral damage that we wouldn't like to happen, and we weigh it against the military value of the target itself in deciding whether or not it's worth it. So for the three COAs in response to a sustained cyber attack by North Korea, we have the active defense. That's the plethora of small attacks on government and military servers. We're only attacking government and military servers. We're targeting the hackers by freezing the electronic assets, as we mentioned before. This is really targeting the hackers and the government and military, not the civilian population. It's based on paper economy. Both of those follow discrimination. Proportionality, as we discussed, should have pretty limited effect on civilians, so we believe it follows both discrimination and proportionality. The last COA, PSYOPs, it's a little different because, yes, we are targeting civilians by turning off their television, but unlike hurting people, there's no harm in turning on a television. People don't have a right to watch North Korean propaganda, so we're not really violating any rights in the first place. Slide, please.
So the next situation that we have in our scenario is that North Korea uses conventional warfare, and what we envision this as being is that two possible scenarios. One is that North Korea engages in a border dispute with South Korea, or North Korea also physically attacks South Korea, either using artillery or actually invading the, crossing over the DMZ and actually physically invading South Korea using its ground and infantry and mobile forces. So our responses, three responses. The first two can be used in unison or either or situation. So we will compromise their C2 capabilities and attacking their integrated air defense system, or in the case that North Korea further escalates the situation, we will actually attack their electrical grid. So we find that all three scenarios are acceptable. The first two are completely acceptable because we are only attacking military targets, right? These aren't civilian targets. They won't have any civilian assets right next to them. In addition, our capabilities to actually wage warfare against the North Koreans will actually gain a lot of advantage by us taking out their ability to command and control their forces to be able to see what's happening on the ground, to see what we're actually doing to them, and to be able to act to our actions as well. So thus, we gain a lot of military advantage by attacking these capabilities. Now, for the attacks on the electrical grids, it's acceptable, however, we must be careful, right? Because we don't know who's actually attached to these electrical grids, whether it be military assets or civilian assets as well. Now, we know that we have intel that blackouts are common in North Korea, and that civilians and protected objects like hospitals or religious objects have the ability to self-sustain themselves through electricity by using their own generators. However, again, we must reduce our influence on these civilian and protected objects by limiting or trying to find out as much information, graphing the maps as much as possible, and reducing our effects on the civilian and protected objects.
The ethical considerations for this COAs, the first two are pretty straightforward. So target command and control and IADs, clearly military targets. In the event we're at conventional war with North Korea, very high value, should be pretty limited civilian casualties, not a big problem. The difficult one is the last one, attacking the power grid. Obviously, this has effect on the civilians. We're going to need to be careful, as Min said, to try to target the power grids around military assets and not just doing it entirely. And then proportionality, even if we do that, very likely there's going to be collateral damage to civilians. So taking the time to consider, where are we in this stage of war? Are we in like full-scale invasion of North Korea? The military value of taking out the power grid is going to go way up. Or are we in a different type of situation where we're not invading North Korea, we don't need that much, then we should take this COA off the list. So it's possible this is ethically okay. It kind of depends on the situation we're at and what value we're at.
A hybrid attack is an attack in which North Korea will employ both conventional and cyber means to attack the United States. So we have 6 responses for this hybrid attack, taken from both conventional responses and cyber responses. That's North Korea attacking us. We are not suggesting any conventional responses because we're a cyber team. COAs 1 and 2 are very similar to each other because they both attack military assets. COA 1 will attack the command and control capabilities, whereas COA 2 will attack the integrated air defense system capabilities. COA 3 is a PSYOPs attack. It will mainly just show that, yes, we can touch you, Kim, regime, and we mean business. COA 4 is the COA that will attack the electrical grids, specifically those around military assets. COA 5 is all about making sure that the hackers they outsource cannot hack anymore through freezing their financial assets. And COA 6 is all about keeping North Korean Cyber Command occupied so that they cannot launch offensive attacks at us anymore.
Alright, so this is our ultimate recommendation. In the event of a sustained cyber attack, it will likely be under the umbrella of our ideal strategy. Just as a reminder, that looks like not forcing regime change, we're not nation building. Ultimately, the Kim regime will remain in power. We'll follow through with active defense, targeting hackers, and psychological operations. In the event of conventional war, consider both the ideal strategy and the adjusted strategy, which looks like regime change, conventional warfare, nation building North Korea. Under the ideal strategy, beneath the threshold, follow through with command control attacks and IAD attacks. With the adjusted strategy, follow through with electrical grid attacks. Lastly, in the event of a hybrid war, once again, consider both strategic outlooks. Under the ideal strategy, follow through with command and control and IAD attacks, active defense, targeting hackers, and psychological operations. Lastly, underneath the umbrella of the adjusted strategy, follow through with electrical grid attacks. Now, like my colleague talked about earlier, one of the greatest challenges with this scenario is the fact that there isn't a lot of precedent, there aren't norms for following through with warfare in the cyber domain. So what we considered when making these recommendations is that there was a lot of weight associated with setting the precedent. We understand that in the future with warfare in the cyber domain, teams like ourselves, operators like ourselves, will consider the precedents that we set and the tactics that we carried or followed through with when making their own decisions. That's everything. Thank you very much for your time, gentlemen.
All right, great job, guys. We're going to open it up to questions from the judges. I ask you to try and be as quick as you can within reason. If I feel like you're going on answering a question for too long, I'll actually cut you off so that we can get to the remainder of judges' questions. With that, feel free to begin, sir.
May I ask, when you present your COAs, if you're directed to roll up or eliminate the overseas cyber teams, either through arrest or attack or killing them? What are the moral and ethical issues involved in doing that? The loopholes one.
The moral issues, I think, concerned with actually like killing them or taking their life is that likely their cyber attacks are not causing bloodshed or loss of life to us. So it would seem a little more extreme to take them out completely as in killing them. As far as arresting them, as they started this, then they did violate our state sovereignty in attacking us with cyber means. So I do think we have the ethical right to arrest them, but I would say go far as bloodshed.
Are the cyber warriors?
On top of that, based on the scenario that we were given, their hackers are largely based outside of the Korean Peninsula. So these hackers could be in China or spread across the Pacific, and they're likely hiding behind VPN or other capabilities to hide their identity. And so the greatest obstacle isn't probably legal or ethical, it's probably just actually finding them. And we're not even violating North Korea's sovereignty in that instance. We could be violating China's sovereignty, we could be violating Thailand's sovereignty. And so, I mean, that's another great obstacle that we would face when thinking about their hackers.
So I guess I'm really asking, are they cyber warriors?
Yes.
Are they guerrillas acting outside of conventional warfare in their own nation? Do they have a status change, or are they just civilian guys, in your view, who are engaged in combat action?
Under legal terms, right, they would actually be known as DPHers, right? So DPH means directly participating in hostilities. Now, while they are civilians, when they're actually engaging in such activities like hacking against us, yes, they can be targeted. But like Liam said, the greatest issue with this is, sovereignty, right? So if it was the North Korean hackers who are engaging against our forces, yes, we can actually go out, kill them through cyber means or physical means. We can also arrest them. However, if it were the Chinese or other hackers like that, we can't physically go out and harm them. What we could do instead is request the governments, the respective governments, Chinese, Russia, so on and so forth, to actually extradite them so that we can bring them to justice.
I think part of the question is where does the line cross from like state hacktivism to like, oh, we're in a legitimate war and these are people are part of it. So if we are in some kind of cyber conflict and they're hacking us and we're responding by hacking them, this doesn't necessarily seem to cross that line of a full-out war. But perhaps in the event that we are in full-out war with North Korea, these cyber elements, some of them may cross that line and out of state hacktivism into like actual soldiers.
Are you therefore advocating preemptive attack based on some level of intelligence that we have, or are you waiting for something to happen first before we respond?
In the cyber world, I feel like it's almost necessary to be preemptive, to be prepared, because if you wait till they attack you, you're sitting there trying to figure out how did they do this, and that's really not tactically sound. Some of the ethical concerns with that is how much are we allowed to attack? There does seem to be quite a bit of precedence, not necessarily ethically, but within the cyber domain, that people attack each other's servers and gain intelligence all the time, and there doesn't seem to be much repercussion, which seems to be a general consensus that at least some of that activity is okay between countries.
Under legal terms, if there isn't a war going on, we must be careful about what we do if we do actually do a preemptive strike, because there are no solid, like I said before, there are no solid norms for cyber warfare. The actions that we do vary in the spectrum of what is considered a use of force, right? So there are not a lot of attacks or actions in terms of cyber warfare that would be classified as a use of force, but we must be aware of what it can be considered as.
One of the classic strategies in warfare is to disrupt the enemy's supply chain, right? So think back to World War II, before the U.S. entered the war, we were supplying arms to our allies, right? We weren't supplying them to Germany and Japan. So Germany was, at this point, conducting unrestricted submarine warfare against shipping to try to stop that, right? So in the context of this, if China or Malaysia or Thailand, et cetera, is supplying capability for North Korean hackers to hack us, is it ethical for us to violate their sovereignty and disrupt the supply chain of cyber activity in North Korea?
I would say if they're involved in the conflict directly, they have surrendered some of those rights to assume not to be attacked.
Yeah, I mean, as members of the international community, if they're engaging with North Korea here, and we have, intelligence that suggests that they're supporting their activities or supporting their provocative actions in the cyber domain, then clearly they're not upholding the expectations or the norm that's been established as members of the international community. So I think a scenario like that, you'd have to go to an international organization like the United Nations and enforce those international norms. They're members there, but you're not meeting our expectations. So these are the consequences that you're going to face. There could be sanctions or something along those lines in response.
One question, you did a thorough job of legal analysis of all of your various courses of action. I just wonder what were your primary references that cover you that you used for determining what laws had to be
right. So as I mentioned, there are no solid norms for cyber warfare. However, the resources that I used came from the Geneva, the Hague Conventions, especially the Convention on the Protection of Victims in International Armed Conflicts.
With regard to one of your courses of action number 3, the propaganda and reaching down and to turn the people's hearts and minds. So first of all, how sophisticated is the compath so that the local farmer can even receive propaganda, and then what are the consequences of being caught listening to propaganda? Is that one of the considerations that should be taken into account for this?
As far as being caught, obviously this is probably going to be more of like a one-time thing, where they turn on their television assuming they're going to be watching the North Korean propaganda and like our propaganda comes on. As with most cyber weapons, they're really most of them one-time things. You use it once, they figure out, oh, this is what they're doing, and they defend it, and it doesn't really happen again. So we're kind of looking at this as it's probably a one-time effect. So most likely people aren't going to get in trouble as they're going to be really turning it off with North Korean propaganda. And the attack is aimed at the regime. It's reaching hearts and minds, but really more it's showing the Kim regime that we can touch your people.
Gentlemen, we have more time. I'd like to ask more questions. Otherwise, we don't have to.
I have another question. It wasn't necessarily related to the ethical or legal, but you said one of your COAs was shutting down North Korea's ability to pay their external hackers. Right, in the traditional banking world, we can do that. We can reach out and shut down their bank accounts. But with the advent of cyber cryptocurrencies, which are unregulated and in the ether, it's more, I guess, conventional. How do you shut that down? Can you shut that down?
None of us are cyber experts, but based on the research we've done, is that right now, so unless we're in the middle of a conventional war, we have boots on the ground, because North Korea is so shut off from the rest of the world, we can only really reach their government military servers and not really any of the rest of their infrastructure, because they are using those electronic monetary assets for their government military servers. We believe that we will be able to have some access to that.
I'm sorry, I don't mean this to sound like a cop-out answer, but it's almost impossible to do research at the unclassified level in terms of the actual tactics that real-life teams that ourselves at places like Cyber Command would do to take that kind of action.
As I said, it was kind of out of the boundaries of the competition. I was just kind of curious if you ran across anything.
Not classified research.
I've done some research, and what basically cryptocurrency is it's data mined and stored on separate computers all over the world, right? So in my experience, I don't think it's possible for us to actually directly attack those currencies and block the currencies. but we can definitely attack and prevent the hackers' access to those cryptocurrencies.
It's very hard to get to the blockchain. You know, it just doesn't happen.
Your quote, glass house throwing stones at a mud hut, is that your team's or is that a research quote?
That came from a quote from a former Air Force OSI cyber operator. He was briefing to a congressional committee, and he was talking about this exact scenario. He was talking about North Korea taking provocative actions in the cyber domain. And he was talking about, you know, the dependence that the United States has on cyber versus the dependence that North Korea has on cyber, and that's where that quote came from.
It's a great quote.
This is just a general question, again, outside of competition. Yeah, not that the War Powers Act, I think, don't go that much, but is any discussion, you come across any discussion for how the War Powers Act and cyber warfare interacting? Is there any kind of stuff that you come across in your research?
So it depends on what type of actions we do in terms of cyber warfare. I mean, we have access to NSA resources, but also like, you know, U.S. Cybercom resources, right? And those are under different titles, right?
Yeah.
I think NSA is under Title 15, while U.S. Cybercom is under Title 10. So it depends on what actions that we can do. If it is taken under Title 15 actions, then they are not regulated by war powers, because obviously that isn't part of the military. However, if it was taken under Title 10 actions, then it would be regulated because it is a military action.
Good to go. All right. Thank you. United States Air Force Academy.